the 11th of February in the year 2000, a brand new airline with a slightly silly name flew its very first flight out of an airport that serious people had spent an entire decade laughing at. 19 months later, the whole American airline industry was on fire. September 11th grounded the entire country, and in the years that followed, one legacy giant after another collapsed into bankruptcy. Airlines that had existed for half a century simply died. But the startup with the silly name did not die, it thrived. And the reason it survived the worst catastrophe in aviation history was the exact same reason everyone had mocked it in the first place. It had bet everything on the one airport nobody else wanted. This is the story of how an airport that had become an industry punchline quietly rewired the way an entire industry thinks about which airports actually matter. And it begins, strangely enough, with a vicious fight over the wrong one. To understand why anyone would laugh at an airport as big as Kennedy, you first have to understand the obsession with its smaller, more crowded neighbor, LaGuardia. LaGuardia sits much closer to Manhattan, a shorter drive, a quicker trip, which made it irresistible to the single most profitable kind of customer in the business, the New York business traveler. The person flying on the company's money who cares about minutes, not fares. Because of that, every legacy carrier in New York wanted a piece of LaGuardia, and they wanted it desperately. American, Delta, United, and the rest poured enormous energy and enormous political muscle into fighting over a tiny fixed number of takeoff and landing slots at an airport that was, physically, simply too small for the demand being crammed into it. LaGuardia had been built decades earlier for a much smaller world, and it showed. The result was chronic congestion, delays that rippled out across the entire national network, and a slot system so tightly controlled that winning access there had almost nothing to do with running a good airline. It was a bureaucratic knife fight, and the airlines that already held slots defended them like their lives depended on it, because losing LaGuardia meant losing the customers who paid the highest fares. For a new airline trying to break in, it was hopeless. You were not competing on service or on price. You were competing against an entrenched, government-controlled pecking order that was rigged by design in favor of the airlines already standing inside it. And all the while, just a short distance away, Kennedy sat there with runway after runway of open, unused capacity, largely ignored by the very same carriers exhausting themselves over LaGuardia's scraps. Kennedy had been built and expanded with the whole world in mind. It was one of America's great gateways to Europe and Asia. Its runways were long. Its terminal footprint was massive. In raw physical terms, its ability to handle flights dwarfed anything LaGuardia could ever dream of. But none of that mattered to a business traveler doing the math on a day trip, because Kennedy sat further out, in a spot that meant more time in traffic, more time lost, more time explaining to a client why the meeting had to be built around an extra hour of driving in each direction. The domestic giants had quietly drawn their own conclusion. They looked at Kennedy as an international airport, and they left the domestic side of it wide open. Over the years, the big names thinned out their domestic flying there and drifted away, leaving whole terminals underused and whole runways quiet. And here is the part that matters most. Nobody among the established airlines seriously considered walking away from the LaGuardia brawl to go build something at Kennedy instead. The obsession with proximity to Manhattan had become an unquestioned law of the industry. It was simply accepted, the way you accept the weather. The airport with all the room to grow was the airport nobody wanted, and the airport everybody wanted was already full. Into that exact imbalance stepped an airline that, at the time, barely existed. JetBlue was the creation of David Neeleman, an entrepreneur who had already built and sold an airline once before, and who was determined to build something different this time. Not another stripped-down, miserable budget carrier, but a low-fare airline that could still feel genuinely pleasant to fly. Now, Neeleman did one thing that almost no startup founder in this business ever manages. He arrived with a war chest, JetBlue launched as one of the most heavily funded startups in American aviation history, sitting on well over $100 million in capital before its wheels ever left the ground. And when that team looked at the New York market, the calculation that had every legacy carrier fixated on LaGuardia simply did not apply to them. They had no existing slots to defend, no existing infrastructure to protect, no realistic path to elbowing their way into an airport already saturated with entrenched enemies. So they looked at the airport everyone else had written off, and they saw the opposite of a liability. They saw a throne with no king. But recognizing the opportunity and actually being allowed to seize it were two very different things. And this is the part of the story that most retellings get badly wrong. People love to imagine that some generous local politician simply handed JetBlue the keys to Kennedy. That is not what happened. Kennedy was governed by a strict federal rule that capped the number of flights allowed in and out during its busiest hours. To fly there on the scale JetBlue wanted, the airline needed formal exemptions from that federal cap, the kind of exemptions the government was authorized to grant specifically to encourage brand new airlines to enter congested airports. So JetBlue did not wait to be given anything. It went and fought for it. It petitioned the Federal Transportation Authorities, made its case, and in 1999, it won. 75 daily landing slots at Kennedy, awarded to a company that had not yet flown a single passenger, phased in over the following years. Local officials cheered the arrival because JetBlue promised cheaper, more convenient flights to cities across New York State that had been badly served for years. But the actual prize, the 75 slots that unlocked the whole strategy, came from a federal door that JetBlue pushed open by itself. And it took one more gift that money alone usually cannot buy: a huge empty terminal, roughly 18 gates of it, abandoned by the big carriers who had drifted away from domestic Kennedy years earlier, sitting there, waiting for someone bold enough to fill it. JetBlue launched into that empty space with a product that felt like it came from a different planet. Brand new Airbus jets, when budget flying meant tired old hand-me-downs. Leather seats when budget flying meant cloth worn thin by 1,000 strangers. And a small television built into the back of every single seat playing live channels when budget flying meant staring at the seat back in silence. Low fares, and yet it felt like a treat. The first flights went to Buffalo and to Fort Lauderdale, and almost immediately the thing worked. But the timing, looking back, turned out to be almost eerie. Because barely a year after JetBlue's very first flight, the attacks of September 11th devastated the entire industry. Planes were grounded across the country, and in the long, grinding aftermath, several of the giant legacy carriers, weighed down by mountains of debt and decades of bloat, staggered into bankruptcy. And here is the reversal that made JetBlue. That same catastrophe, the one that crippled the giants, quietly handed the young startup its opening. Because JetBlue had entered the world lean and new and carrying very little debt, exactly the opposite of the aging giants around it. As the country slowly, nervously began to fly again, travelers were more price conscious than they had been in years, and warier than ever of the wobbling, half-bankrupt legacy carriers. And there sat JetBlue, cheaper, newer, friendlier. Already dominant at an airport where it faced almost no serious competition because the giants were too busy nursing their own wounds to even notice what was being built under their noses. The disaster that killed the strong ended up feeding the young. And through the whole of that decade, JetBlue quietly became something the giants had never once bothered to build for themselves: a real, dominant hub at Kennedy, anchored by an airline that actually wanted to be there. What makes this story so satisfying is how completely it flipped the conventional wisdom that had ruled New York aviation for decades. For years, the assumption behind every strategic decision had been simple: proximity to Manhattan is everything. That single belief drove the whole endless, expensive war over LaGuardia's slots. And JetBlue's success quietly proved it wrong. It turned out that a huge segment of travelers, when offered genuinely attractive fares, were perfectly happy to accept a slightly less convenient airport in exchange for real savings. That was the actual bet at the heart of everything. Not a bet on runways or terminals, but a bet on human behavior. A wager that price could beat convenience for enough people to build an entire airline around. Plenty of executives at rival carriers would have confidently told you at the time that convenience always wins in a market as wealthy and time-starved as New York. JetBlue proved them incomplete. It demonstrated that a large ignored slice of travelers, both vacationers and increasingly cost-conscious business flyers, were genuinely willing to make that trade. And they made it, flight after flight, year after year. By the middle of that decade, JetBlue had transformed from a scrappy startup at an unwanted airport into one of the most closely watched airlines in America. And in doing so, it revealed something the entire industry had somehow missed. That an airport's value is not fixed. It is not carved in stone by its distance from a city center. It can be completely reshaped by which airline decides to believe in it, and how fully that airline commits to using the capacity sitting there, quiet and waiting. Kennedy, once a symbol of everything wasteful and underused about New York aviation, became a symbol of something else entirely. Contrarian opportunity, seized and proven. Living proof that the most valuable real estate in an industry is not always the real estate everyone is already fighting over. And there is a lesson buried in here that reaches far beyond airplanes. It is a lesson about the specific hidden value of an asset that everyone else has quietly agreed is not worth having. LaGuardia's appeal was never really questioned. The belief that proximity to Manhattan mattered above all else had simply become the unexamined starting point for how the whole industry thought. And it took an outsider, a startup with nothing to lose and no old infrastructure to defend, to look at the exact same market from a completely different angle and realize that the assumption itself was the real constraint, not the airport everyone had written off. This pattern, powerful incumbents locked into defending the obvious, while a genuinely valuable alternative sits ignored in plain sight, shows up again and again in industry after industry, every time a newcomer quietly rewrites the rules. The legacy carriers were not stupid. They were simply so deep inside one way of seeing the world that a different way never got a serious hearing until an outsider proved it could work. But here is the part that turns this triumph bittersweet. Everything that made this bet brilliant was tied to a specific moment in time. The bet on Kennedy worked so well precisely because the conditions of that decade were perfect for it. Weakened giants, favorable costs. A first-mover advantage at an airport nobody else would contest, and markets do not stay frozen. The very success JetBlue built would eventually attract the exact kind of competition that made its original advantage almost impossible to hold on to. As the scrappy upstart grew into a large established airline in its own right, it began to face the very forces it had once exploited. Rising costs, an aging fleet, legacy carriers who finally woke up and started contesting the routes JetBlue had claimed for free, and newer, leaner budget airlines, willing to undercut JetBlue on price the exact same way JetBlue had once undercut everyone else. The uncontested throne at Kennedy slowly became just one more contested seat in a crowded, brutal market. And the bet that built the airline would, decades later, curdle into the very thing that put its survival in doubt. But that fall is a different story, a darker chapter that deserves its own telling. What matters here, what you should carry away from the rise is this. Kennedy did not become valuable because the airport changed, the runways did not move, the terminals did not shift. Manhattan did not get any closer. Kennedy became valuable because one airline, with nothing to lose, finally looked at what was already sitting there and decided that everyone else's assumptions about what mattered most were simply wrong. The airport nobody wanted changed an entire industry, not because the airport transformed, but because somebody for the first time looked at it correctly. And the strangest twist of all is still to come, because that same airport, the one JetBlue conquered when nobody else would touch it, would one day become the only thing about JetBlue that anyone wanted at all. If this changed the way you think about how JetBlue actually became one of the biggest airlines in New York, subscribe. And tell me in the comments. Would you have bet on Kennedy back in the late 1990s when every expert in the industry was betting against it? And stay close, because the story of what happened to JetBlue after this rise, the slow, quiet undoing of everything you just watched it build, is a very different and a far more troubling chapter still to come.